You probably think you already understand the Wild West Saloon. Swinging doors, a long bar, cheap whiskey, a piano in the corner, and a gunfight waiting to happen. In that version of the story, the saloon is basically a prop for frontier violence. A backdrop. What you miss is that for many Western towns, the saloon was not the backdrop at all. It was the business model. The real story is hiding in the ledgers, the licensing books, the wholesale invoices, and the payroll cycle, not in the shootouts. Between 1872 and 1876, local historians estimate that Dodge City consumed about 2,250 barrels of whiskey, roughly 70,875 gallons, or more than 4.5 million drinks, in 4 years, in one frontier cattle town. Not a typo. So if you want to understand the economics of owning a Wild West saloon, you have to start before the saloon itself, before the mirrored back bar and the gambling rooms and the chandeliers. You start with the frontier economy that made those places possible. The late 19th century West was full of towns that were rich in one very specific way and unstable in almost every other. Railheads filled up during cattle season and then quieted down. Mining camps boomed on the strength of one seam, one strike, one rumor, and could collapse just as fast. Cash arrived in bursts. So did people. Young, mostly male, often transient, sometimes armed, frequently paid in lump sums after long stretches of work. That matters more than the mythology does. Because a saloon does not need elegance. It needs concentrated cash and exhausted customers. And the West kept producing both. Cowboys on the trail might earn around $25 to $35 a month by the 1880s, with some ranges higher and some lower, according to labor compilations and wage references used by economic historians. Miners in a place like Tombstone could do better. The National Park Service's historical material on the town notes union wages there at $4 a day when the mines were running 3 shifts. Different labor markets. Same principle. Men were paid hard money after hard work, and somebody was always waiting to catch that money before it left town. Here's what nobody told you. The saloon was one of the first businesses to open because it solved a frontier problem immediately. It converted isolation, boredom, wage cash, and mail traffic into daily sales. That is why saloons appeared before many banks, before decent hotels, sometimes before churches, and very often in numbers that looked irrational. By any conventional analysis, too many of them should have failed. They didn't. Not quickly, anyway, because most of them were not really competing just on liquor. They were competing for location, for operating hours, for payroll timing, and for everything that could be sold after the first drink. So how did a Wild West saloon actually make money? The simplest answer is that it lived or died on 3 things. First, whether it sat close to a reliable stream of wages. Second, whether the owner could keep margins high on the drink itself. And third, whether the bar captured the customer's spending after the first glass through gambling, meals, tobacco, sex work, lodging, credit, or simply time. 3 layers. Traffic, margin, attachment. Keep those 3 in mind, because the pattern repeats. Start with Abilene in the early 1870s, one of the first big Kansas cattle towns. Abilene did not become notorious because somebody decided it should have a romantic frontier atmosphere. It became profitable because Joseph McCoy's cattle shipping system turned it into a funnel. Herds arrived. Drovers arrived with them. Money arrived with both. And almost immediately, the town had to decide what to do with saloons, because saloons followed the cash faster than almost any other business. City records and later work in the Kansas Historical Quarterly show how direct the argument was. On May 1, 1871, Abilene's local leaders argued over what a saloon license should cost. Some favored $100 a year. Others wanted $200. Still others wanted a prohibitive $500. That debate tells you everything. The town was not asking whether saloons should exist. It was asking how much revenue could be extracted from them without killing the trade. Rigid rule, hard constraint. If the fee was too low, vice expanded and the city lost leverage. If the fee was too high, owners would dodge it, move, or bribe around it. So the saloon became a fiscal instrument almost immediately, a taxable vice the town needed and publicly disliked at the same time. And the details get even more revealing. One local recollection cited in that same Abilene history says ice cut from the Republican River was delivered in 1871 to 11 saloons and a hotel at 6 cents a pound, cash on the barrel head. 6 cents a pound for ice. In a cattle town, that means the better establishments were already spending real money on customer experience because cold beer and chilled storage were competitive advantages, not luxuries. Advantages. Which brings us to the first layer, traffic. A saloon owner in Abilene was not betting on refined local demand. He was betting on concentrated seasonal demand. Drovers came off the trail after weeks or months of monotonous work, sleep deprivation, dust, risk, and deferred pay. The town did not need to persuade them to seek release. That demand already existed. The owner's problem was simpler and colder than that. Get close to where the men arrived. Stay open when they wanted service. Offer the first acceptable room they saw with light, noise, cards, and alcohol. That is why so many frontier saloons were barely dressed-up operations at first. As historian Richard Seltzer notes in a broad survey of Western saloons, startup costs could be very low in the roughest phase. A tent, a rough counter, a supply of harsh whiskey, a few barrels, a few tables. Management sophistication optional. Product market fit obvious. The customer was already there. But low startup cost did not mean low risk. It just meant the risk was different. Fire risk, theft, sudden ordinances, bad debt, violent customers, seasonal demand, reputation, and the biggest one of all, the possibility that your customers would spend one drink's worth and then drift to the place next door with better cards, colder beer, or more attractive backroom offerings. So the second layer mattered. Margin. This is where Dodge City becomes useful because the numbers are blunt. A Western Cattle Trail Association history drawing on Boot Hill Museum expertise notes that in the town's early years a gallon of whiskey could cost around $2 and individual drinks could sell for 25 cents. Even allowing for variation in pour size, spillage, theft, and quality, that is a startling markup. And that is before dilution, before watering the whiskey, before upselling tobacco, before gambling losses, before rented rooms and sex work in adjoining spaces, before meals. A lot of frontier whiskey was bad, sometimes very bad. Rotgut was not just an insult. It was a pricing category disguised as a drink. Owners cut costs because customers were not buying craftsmanship. They were buying speed, effect, social access, and participation in the one room in town where things were happening. Here's the problem. If you look only at the bar, the economics still seem impressive. But the bar alone does not explain the saturation level. The attached spending does. In a basic working-class saloon, a man might buy a beer for 5 cents, a shot of whiskey for 25, and maybe a premium cigar for another 5, as period Western sources summarized by historians show. That sounds modest. And in isolation, it was. A cowboy earning about $30 a month could drink, smoke, and leave without financial annihilation. That part is important. Contrary to the movie image, a man usually did not lose an entire month's wages just by sitting at the bar. He lost it at the tables. That distinction matters because it changes what the bar was for. The drink was often the entry price into a longer chain of spending. The saloon owner did not necessarily need to ruin every customer on liquor. He needed to lengthen the visit. Keep the man inside for another hour. Then another. Keep him gambling. Keep him ordering. Keep him in orbit around the business. Time was monetized. Attention was monetized. Weakness was monetized. And saloon owners knew it. Better establishments layered the room accordingly. Bar in front. Tables behind. Gambling farther back. Sometimes restaurant service. Sometimes wine rooms or side entrances where female workers met customers. Sometimes entertainment. Sometimes a barber, a shoeshine stand, or a tobacco counter. According to historians of Western saloons, the better houses could employ bartenders, porters, tobacco operators, and even a special policeman whose badge came from the city but whose paycheck came from the owner. That is not just a bar. That is an ecosystem designed to hold a customer in place. So what happened when the traffic was not seasonal but industrial? When the wages were larger, the shifts more regular, and the town ran around the clock. Then you got Tombstone. Tombstone is useful because its numbers are too large to sentimentalize. The National Park Service record on the town states that by 1881 Tombstone had a population of about 6,000, and by around 1885 perhaps 10,000, making it the largest town in the territory at its peak. By 1884, according to the same historical material, Roughly $25 million had been taken out of the ground in silver. 25 million in the 1880s. And the mines were running 3 shifts, with union wages at $4 a day. Now think about what that means for a saloon owner. Your customers are not scattered homesteaders. They are paid workers cycling off industrial shifts. They are tired. They are paid in cash. They need meals, drink, diversion, information, company, and sometimes credit. The historical record says nearly 110 places in Tombstone were licensed to sell liquor, and most sold other things as well. Hotels, saloons, gambling dens, dance halls, brothels, roaring 24 hours a day. By any conventional analysis, that level of competition should have crushed margins. It didn't, because demand was being refreshed continuously by the mines. 3 shifts. Continuous intake. That is the crucial part. A cattle town might spike with arrivals. A mining town like Tombstone could pulse day and night. Traffic, margin, attachment. Again, traffic came from the mines. Margin came from liquor sold into an unusually cash-rich environment. Attachment came from everything clustered around the drink. Gambling, lodging, meals, female companionship sold through neighboring rooms or affiliated spaces. Information exchange, hiring talk, political talk, deals. A saloon in that environment was not merely serving alcohol. It was serving as the unofficial social and commercial lobby of the town. And this is where the history gets colder. The most respectable men in a frontier community were often not the men pouring the drinks. Historians note that many Western saloons effectively sat on 3 ownership layers: the landowner, the building owner, and the business proprietor. That arrangement spread risk and blurred liability. The church elder could collect rent from the property. The local notable could hold title to the lot. The visibly disreputable operator at street level absorbed the scandal. Clean hands above, cash flow below. That arrangement also helps explain why saloons persisted through moral campaigns longer than you might expect. When reformers attacked vice, they were not just attacking a bartender. They were attacking a property network and a municipal revenue stream. In Fort Worth, for example, a liquor license cost $650 a year in the late 19th century, according to Western saloon histories, and an 1879 Texas law imposed an 18% tax on every hard liquor drink sold. Think about that for a moment. A town could condemn saloons in public and depend on them on paper. That is the third case. Not the boomtown. Not the cattle railhead. The maturing western city where the saloon had already become fiscally legible. Once government arrived, the saloon stopped being just a private business and became a semi-regulated extraction point. Licenses, taxes, operating rules, Sunday closures, gaming restrictions. The owner had to calculate not just supply and demand, but tolerance. How much would the town allow? How much would the town pretend not to see? Could food service be split off to avoid regulation? Could gambling be moved behind a door? Could women be present through a side room rather than the main bar? Could the same building house separate functions under separate names? That is why a bad saloon could survive in a good location and a good saloon could fail in a bad one. That is why towns with transient male populations could support absurd numbers of drinking establishments. That is why gambling mattered so much. That is why city councils argued about licenses almost as soon as cattle or miners showed up. And that is why the saloon often functioned as more than a bar. Historians of frontier institutions point out that public houses could serve, at different times and in different places, as informal post offices, political rooms, hiring points, trading posts, and social headquarters. In other words, the saloon monetized centrality. Once you see that, a lot of frontier behavior stops looking chaotic and starts looking procedural. The owner needed access to supply. He needed wholesale liquor that was cheap enough, or adulterated enough, to preserve spread. He needed enough seating, light, and entertainment to hold customers. He needed someone trusted enough to tend the bar and someone hard enough to remove problem drinkers. He needed to stay on the right side of whichever marshal, alderman, sheriff, or county official mattered that month. He needed to know when payroll hit. He needed to know where railroad crews spent, where drovers unloaded, where miners finished shift, where gamblers preferred to sit, where respectable men wanted plausible deniability. Nothing romantic about it, just systems. And the human cost sits inside those systems, not outside them. A cowboy making $30 a month could afford a few drinks. He could not afford a long losing streak at faro or poker. A miner earning $4 a day in Tombstone might look well paid, until three-shift fatigue, irregular luck, and an expensive nighttime economy started intercepting those wages almost as fast as they arrived. Women working around saloons, whether in dance halls, wine rooms, or adjacent brothels, were part of the same extraction chain, earning money in a structure that exposed them to violence, disease, legal vulnerability, and abrupt ruin when towns turned moral or went broke. And because many respectable investors stood one layer removed from the visible vice, the people absorbing the daily damage were rarely the ones safest from the collapse. Then came regulation, then reform, then the slow narrowing of what a saloon could legally bundle under one roof. That shift mattered because it cut directly into the attachment layer. Historians note that when gambling was pushed underground and Sunday closings or hour limits were enforced, saloons suffered not just because they sold fewer drinks, but because men stayed for less time and spent less money overall. The bar could survive as a bar, but the frontier saloon had been more than a bar, and that more was where much of the money lived. So if you had bought a saloon in the Wild West, what exactly would you have owned? Maybe a tent and barrels in a new cattle stop. Maybe a substantial building on a mining town street, with rent due to a landlord who never intended to stain his own hands. Maybe a profitable bar with terrible whiskey and exceptional foot traffic. Maybe a losing operation in a town with too many rivals and not enough payroll. Maybe a machine for turning wholesale liquor into steady cash. Maybe a machine for turning men's wages into other people's rent. Maybe, if you were ambitious and politically connected, a combined business that skimmed value from nearly every form of frontier leisure. That is why the answer to the title is stranger than it looks. The economics of owning a Wild West saloon were not mainly the economics of alcohol. They were the economics of concentration. Concentrated wages, concentrated loneliness, concentrated male demand, concentrated operating hours, concentrated vice under one roof. The bottle was the visible product. The real product was controlled spending in a town built too fast to protect the people passing through it. And that is the quiet warning buried in the frontier ledger. Whenever an economy learns how to capture workers' pay at the exact place they go to escape the work, the entertainment is never the whole business.